This is Specific Objects, Talks on Art in the Catskills, and I'm your host, Miriam Atkin. Today I have here with me in the studio sound artist Robbie Wing and poet Ryan Skrabalak, both of whom are based in the Hudson Valley. So before we start, I'll mention that this is the second episode in which I'm using a new format for the show. I'm experimenting with a more informal conversational approach rather than a traditional interview. So the pieces that we'll discuss during this show we're all encountering for the first time, and this will be a spontaneous discussion of what we hear. And we'll start with Road Sounds, a piece by Robbie Wing. So I mentioned the title of the piece. Robbie, I'm wondering if you can give us just a little bit more context for it.
Yeah, I kind of forgot all about titles when I sent it over, and so it's good because it works. It's the title is essentially the folder name of a set of recordings that a sculptor friend of mine who is currently living in Tulsa, where I'm from, Tulsa, Oklahoma. The folder was what he called it, was Road Sounds, and I kind of forgot about that piece of it. And he's working on this show that's going to be in New York City that opens Saturday, and so it's the collections of sounds from locations of photographs that he took, and we wanted to do some kind of work together. And so this is kind of the collage, kind of getting to know the sounds, figuring out what works with them, and then there'll be a version that's kind of more set for a gallery, and so which will have like sculptural components of them. Yeah, the sounds are from places that I'm pretty familiar with, and when I'm not able to be in a place, I really do like to work that way, where somebody else who has kind of an investment into a place is the one who's doing the recording. And so for Shane, he's kind of built this body of work and is kind of looking to explore it sonically.
Yeah, so that makes it feel very collaborative to me, because just the act of selecting like what you're going to record in real time feels creative, and then it gets passed on to you, and then you're altering it. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I'd say so. It would definitely has to kind of start with a conversation. And so in a way, like, my approach could be that, like, within that conversation, enough is pulled out that the conversation itself kind of acts as a score for listening or a score for recording. If anything else comes from that, like, I might have it didn't happen in this case, but if we had kept going with it, I would have probably just written a score. I started working on one for myself on how to like approach these sounds in the studio, and so like I spent a lot of time placing myself in contexts that are not dissimilar to the ones in the recording, which is kind of like the context of everywhere in a lot of ways. There's definitely like, even though it's road sounds and this particular type of bird that seems to show up in downtown Tulsa in kind of a high population, I was thinking of things like, what happens when a sound disappears? Like what happens when a sound's heading away from you? And what happens, or what is it, the quality of a sound when it's heading towards you? Those kind of things. So I think kind of building like a score based on qualities of sounds heading in certain directions, and what highlights, what I can kind of, when in the editing process, what is emphasizing those.
I'd be curious to see one of your scores.
Me too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, I find that really interesting, like what you said about the conversation functioning as a score. And, yeah, I mean, can you try to somehow describe how the score that you landed on kind of functions? Or what were some of the instructions that you gave yourself?
Yeah, I think when it comes to, in those particular cases, it was almost like, what is what's the specific frequency or the specific like container of frequency that gets across that point, and so even like in the recording, you can hear Shane talking, and Shane's talking to the person who's working the car wash booth. And so Shane, I think, as one does when kind of going in and field recording, you like, I haven't talked to him about it, but I almost think that he was explaining to the person that he's going to be holding something as he goes through the car wash, and so kind of like giving a precursor for like
Don't freak out.
Yeah, or something, you know. But for some reason, rather than giving that conversation a full frequency spectrum, it seemed like it worked within the context to have it kind of like rounded off and pushed to the end. So you're almost given the like idea of this conversation, you know, and it is kind of a work in progress. So it might even become more implied, you know, and it is not random that like the car becomes the focal point of a set of recordings from somebody who's living in Tulsa. You know, it's definitely one of those cities that's designed for it and built around oil and gas. But where in the frequency spectrum creates the idea of the car, or how does a frequency spectrum move as the car goes from close to you to far away and then no longer audible? And so those were some of the things, these kind of like glimpses of sound, limiting like a frequency spectrum, and then trying to find a way to create movement. Yeah. And then in the gallery setting, like I'm building these speaker systems for them, and so they'll be spread across like a gallery floor that's like 50 feet, and so the left and right channel are 50 feet apart. And so in the installation, the score or the like prompt for myself is, what are all the ways you can move sound from one side of the room to the other? You know, so yeah.
This conversation is like hovering around the first two questions that came to my mind, which were, one, I think a lot about field recording as a genre or like a mode that is like whether it wants to be or not, like really concerned with like autobiography. And knowing Shane is in Tulsa and you as like a person from Tulsa, like, are there approaches that you make to like a Tulsa sound?
Which, yeah, that's actually hilarious because like Tulsa has it wouldn't take you too long to find a sticker that says that the Tulsa sound, which definitely revolves around like the music culture of Tulsa.
Yeah.
And so, you know, this kind of like mix of country and rock would be like the Tulsa sound, I guess. But it's interesting to work with material that's directly from Tulsa, so it's like very much the Tulsa sound. I also think there's the Tulsa smell, which is like a reference to oil and gas refineries. And Tulsa's an amazing place. But I don't know. I think it's just like staying on field recording. Like I feel like my relationship to field recording on my own has changed, and you know, and I definitely think I've like play around in that kind of like idea of well, what is it to record? Is that like a method of extraction too? And so kind of finding ways to where like a relationship to the place becomes really integral in where the sound recordings are coming from. And then also I have this question of, you know, why are we bringing the sound of outdoors indoors, and like what's the appeal and what's the quality? And so I think like I definitely try to find like an approach to editing, I guess, where there's like slight tweaks, you know. And so there was a lot of bird calls from the street downtown Archer, which is like by the day center there and by the prison, but also by like the cool brewery, you know, like so that is like the acoustic landscape in a lot of ways. But I feel like you almost like have to tweak them, and so there's this like digitizing and like pitching down or stretching of things.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I'm really intrigued by what you said about extraction, and it just got me thinking about what that means in relation to a piece like this. And it didn't feel like the spaces were being claimed or dominated or sold. It felt maybe like they were being Yeah, I guess like foregrounded for the sake of allowing the listener to have a real close relationship with something that might otherwise be overlooked. I mean, so do you struggle with when you make art feeling like you're removing the thing from its rightful place, or recontextualizing it is somehow violating the identity of the thing?
That's a great question. I don't know. I mean, I would like to think that I'm being that thoughtful all the time, where I'm really, really considering like my decision making in the context of why I make every decision. But it could be just one of those like you just can't get away from it, regardless. And so, to a certain extent, yeah, there's always like a recontextualizing. What does it mean, or why play sounds from Tulsa in New York City? Like what's the purpose,
What's the purpose
of it?
Yeah.
When you could very well go outside and there's also going to be a car and a bird.
Yeah.
And so
why bring Tulsa into the...
Yeah, and so I don't think I have like an answer for that, but I think it's something that I'm always kind of like living with,
Yeah.
I think there's something fundamentally pleasurable to people about experiencing things out of context. And I think about like, the whole YouTube genre of a road trip being filmed like from the passenger seat. There's something that's really pleasurable about observing this activity that you do all the time, but taken out of context.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Or like the train going like the tram driver driving through the city.
Yeah.
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 Same.
But then I just kind of like seeing it from a different way. Like the other piece that I kind of refer to, and I thought of it because you said the train is like a sculpture of railroad ties with speakers attached to them with several sounds, including like feedback components from resonating the ties, but also of the train that's right next door. And so one of those like prompts or one of those kind of questions was what happens when you play a sound back to itself, and so yeah, I don't know where I'm going with that, but it's just like that why take it from one place into another, and then what happens when you play it the sound back to itself. I think it's really interesting.
You're listening to WGXC Acra 90.7 FM, and this is Specific Objects, Talks on Art in the Catskills. I'm your host, Miriam Atkin, and today I'm talking with sound artist Robbie Wing and poet Ryan Skrabalak. Now, Ryan Skrabalak is going to read from his book, National Lube.
Nourishing Residuals begins with preface by out of a book by Brian Masumi called Parables for the Virtual, and this is him talking about Frank Sinatra. The genius of his style was to personalize a composed singularity of vital movements in a way that it could collectively spread. He lyrically reinvented heterosexuality as a popular culture virus. I fingered the slow part, having reached the end of the sensation that turned me into someone bad. He watched. Filled throat shameful, the pearls sang wildly in nowhere time. Did rub it until growing. Its event moved through me like good news. I was afraid of the edge and brought some lacquer for that reason, to make it curved and shiny, but it became the breath of blank. I had to separate the space from the composition, from the voice and its private register. Anyways, we ate unburst fruits in the cat stretch of a forever veil of cashmere lunch hour. What language will? Me on my knees in fistfights of peonies, swan dive, E-flat minor, contralto dative, where I give him mercy. Removing the jumper cables from soft upper pinks, peach juice serif, lips summer puff. Over his newsworthy serrations, run fingers, a heat adheres. What's a climber to a ladder? A street to a motive, a surgeon to an archive. I could have been better in a few ways, or baseless. I fashioned from his will a little umbilical bonchance for lapping, and laid him back in a country constantly at war, but gave him a few minutes elsewhere to think, or envision a more saturated shape of we. Back at it, a few jolts. Words shepherded themselves from storm drains, but they're supposed to go down like good news. I was afraid of that edge. These are expensive sentences. We relax the throat. Richer ones in the background, still on camera, pout for me. In this way, time became just here, nodding forward into green confirmation. Do I ask you to stay? I'm choosing to be sad, to feel something glowing. I remember me. In the door jamb with no diseases, holding my friends like babies, kissing them, no rent or mortgages, and the small death of their rooting. I don't need pills, booze, coffee, emails, texting. You tell me this for the second time. There's a party in a country constantly at war. I give him a few minutes. Whatever time it is right now, it's not. In the end, the weather breaks free from its conversation with the land. The manifold techniques by which socio-political hierarchies are camouflaged in the natural features of the human body. Men hiding things in air, and then pushing them into sound. The cars make the lake shine, a reproduction of silver in its Pindaric rolling. 16 quasars reflected in the Virch's bolted bark. Slow hand stared back at me like an organ solo in the mist. A rare and different tune. Socio-political hierarchies are camouflaged in the natural psychic attachment to objects, the canonical transit of Earth, and in that walking's essence throughout the financial crisis, wildly in nowhere time. What else are we supposed to do? Where was I? The lake beats vellum wings below the boats, an anteroom of throat-embroidered void, ambrosia. They want me to focus on this uncatchable light, the half-life of my shame, which never goes away but decays viscous. But not the evictions, money vomiting out of palms, fences rising nowhere from grass. The fix is in and floats by over blue-perfect weather. Stealing away from the airport pond in the glue of the twilight's cashmere tents, I made an honest mistake. In there and in that I'm implemented in photosensitive maps, distant mind song, exchange gessoed over my tongue, a warrant for deviance. They want me to focus on this uncatchable light spiraling in and out of an equation that only makes sense if you're evil, mangled, or both. Do they know we're together among the garbage and the flowers? Does a lens exist in darkness too? What information collects in a country constantly at war? What's a climber to a ladder? We hit the road in a gorgeous size. Rushing along the gray, constantly cleaning itself in drone, this car hummed a color of bright G blue sliding back into red, but we held the space of an aqua E-flat. I cannot comprehend the velocity of the pass, even while these biometrics open sluices, fluid directed back down my own obvious purple holes. I find immense hope in zero ambition. In shuffling the architectures, the younger bits became infutured past their isotropic limits, the lake within a hole within the meadow upon the boy inside of me, and stepping out perchance to dream upon the plane of rustled screens against the air. Over my tongue, a warrant for deviance elsewhere to think or envision a more saturated shape of we. I had to separate the space from the half-life composition of my shame, which never goes away but decays viscous. In any event, I filled a notebook with endless hedgerows. I can't squeeze the epithets out of my secret life inside a pedigree like good news. I was afraid, in a country constantly at war, wildly in nowhere time, did rub a motive. Surgeon, the weather, break free, a rare and different tune, camouflaged in the natural features, this uncatchable light, spiraling out within the boy upon the meadow inside of my shame, which never goes in the background, still on camera. What else are we supposed to do? Slow hand, here is where I spend most of my day. Maybe something is settling on the decade. Snow. Obvious biometrics, envisioned limits, but moved through. I practice a soft damage through a lyrical sequence of pushing mercy into sound, a pre-existing condition. Together we've defaked the background of an honest mistake, in other words, uncatchable light, endless hedgerows, the airport pond spiraling out the architectures that I'm implemented in Pindar. Bon chance. I was afraid of the edge of the event. In return, I filled a notebook. I find immense hope in nowhere time. I fingered the slow part inside of me. Its event moved through me like a lake's innate shine. Is this considered a rarity? As I read this poem, I realize you might need to do some slight rearranging. The angles in their contralto hum keep speeding. Mercy, pink snow on my knees, jealous much? My shame which goes, my secret life, my private register. I had to find the space between endless juxtaposed news, screens and money, vellum limits, men hiding things in air. They know we're together. They want me to focus on this reproduction of mist, but the meadow's still on camera. In this way, time became reflected in a country constantly at war. I practice a warrant for deviance, a saturated shape of we. These are expensive sentences. We relax the throat.
I'm really struck by the composition and the way that lines and pieces of lines are being shuffled and reconfigured. There's this line that you read. As I read this poem, I realize you might need to do some slight rearranging. And when you read that line, it occurred to me that these poems are kind of, they're always reading themselves in a way, because it's like everything is already material. Like as soon as it's already poetic material as soon as it comes out, material that's going to be reconfigured and reshuffled, and it feels very sculptural, which is really great, following the piece that we just heard from Robbie. And I have a lot of questions, but one thing, with the room kind of still resonating from Robbie's piece, I'm kind of curious about what are the places and scenes and experiences that this was generated out of. I want to kind of know if there is a where and a what.
Yeah. Good question. When Robbie started playing Roads, I got excited, if not because this book was like mainly written on the road, going back and forth from Lawrence, Kansas to Albany, New York, I'm from Albany and was living in Lawrence at the time, and spent a lot of time on what I like to call the United States' most spiritually bankrupt road, Interstate 70, which is just, 4 lanes of really flat, lots of like billboards about like porn, injury lawyers, and this is just the road. I'm not talking about the places that it goes through, because I don't, one of the things about the road is that it sort of forecloses, I think, a lot of the futures that you can like take, or forecloses a lot of possibilities that you take when you leave the road, right? Like there's something that's really, the interstate is like you're on that thing, and that's it, right? And it just so happens to be really kind of like a physically and emotionally hellish place. And so that's where a lot of the poems come from. Just a lot of time, like introspectively, a lot of time to oneself. But, passing through, what seems to be basically just like a huge blanket of Monsanto soybeans and corn, with the occasional population center somewhere. But for the most part, it's loves and flying jays and people going like absurdly fast in an effort to go from one place to the next.
A long drive on an American Midwestern interstate is definitely a place. I mean, where your thinking can do the kind of interesting looping
Yeah.
that I'm kind of hearing in these poems.
Yeah, the poems, like the actual, like the mechanics of the thought process are totally there, right? That just sort of like consistent spiral. All the poems in this first section are all sonnets. They're all 14-line poems. I think a lot about the sonnet as like a form of enclosure, but kind of what the sonnet does in the middle of it, sort of like a gem that you can sort of unlock, or like a codex that you can kind of unlock to make what is like sort of a selfish form, like very generous. So I thought about the sort of like mechanics of thinking in a place like that, and also was thinking about what the friend, acquaintance, and poet J.P. Garcia, who's like an Albany poet, thinks about or has been sort of studying about, which is like synth poetics, and like taking this sort of earlier models of, for example, like what Brian Eno did in Roxy Music, as, or, you know, like Milan Knizak, or like sort of cut paste, I don't know, almost like Fluxus type things where you're like literally rearranging them, but sort of similar to the conversation where you're just having, like really screwing with the frequencies of certain certain cadences, or certain sort of like leitmotifs, or whatever, however you want to call it, in a sort of like cyclical or anti-cyclical way.
Yeah, I think I made like a couple. I found myself just kind of jotting as you were reading, but I don't think I totally noticed the row. Like, yeah, just kind of going back to it for 1 second. But also now that you're like referring to particular musicians, and then also the structure and the composition of it. But this whole thing about this part where you're saying rushing along the gray, constantly cleaning itself in a drone, and then referring to very specific musical notes. But also kind of intermixing color in it too. I thought it's like a really like beautiful description. But I also think it's funny because I do a lot with drone, and like oftentimes kind of like the combining of notes, and sometimes I wonder if I'm just recreating like the sound of my car, which has like its own problems, which sound like the like binaural beat, like frequencies of like my tire needing to get changed. So I thought that was, very interesting, like that even the long stretch of the road, you were mentioning kind of the musical qualities of it.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, this is only related to your car, but I'm like, no, I'm like, I think electric and hybrid vehicles with that like whooshing sound are killing ambient music. I loathe that sound. Mm-hmm. It's like so creepy. Give me the motor. I don't know. Maybe that's my like Luddite opinion of the day.
I'm also just like I was following along on the page while you were reading, and it's very, the composition is so virtuosic. I'm really amazed by it. It's like the fact, I mean, listeners can't be aware of this, but they're 14-line poems, but they continue from page to page, so it sounded seamless when you were reading it. And because they look like prose blocks, it's hard to say whether or not the line breaks are intentional, because in prose you just break the line wherever the page stops.
Yeah.
And they seem like both, which is really awesome. Like, they're clearly intentional, but they also feel like they're not at the same time, if that makes sense. I guess I'm just wondering, like, did you, well, you said, I mean, they're sonnets, but how much of the form was, like, did you predetermine And how much of it did you kind of discover while you were writing?
Good question. I often find myself writing poems that are not sonnets, that are not 14 lines, but look like sonnets on the page. And by that I mean like this sort of like really tight, dense block that appears in a specific quadrant of the page. And in this opening section, there are 14 of them. So, in poetic term, that's like a sonnet crown, right? Which is, yeah, I guess going back to what I said earlier, just like has always felt really stodgy to me, as like, I mean, just like the name, like just like, oh, a sonnet crown, you know, a crown of sonnets. And yeah, I just like recollect like something that's like really sort of like crystalline and unmovable, or like sort of unflinching in its sort of like a crystalline nature, right? It's like they're fixed. And so working within them, I was like, okay, I don't know, I just sort of felt like how to like run the words through them as if it was like liquid, or as if it was like a water, or to animate the crown as if the crown were made of like nothing solid, but something a little bit more liquid. And so if you consider the poem the landscape, I'm often thinking about the anti-landscape, or like the shape that the white space brings. And that's like sort of like difficult to do in a traditional sonnet. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but it's what I was thinking about, I guess.
Yeah, well, it just seems like you're thinking very carefully about form, and that definitely comes through. So you two have collaborated, and it's clear that you think through music when you're writing poetry. And I guess, yeah, Robbie, I'm curious about your relationship to text. And maybe I'm also just curious about the collaborations that you've done and how you process each other's work as you're collaborating.
I'd be curious what Ryan thinks about that. Also, yeah, I always find it like interesting too, like your like time you spent in Lawrence, Kansas, because it was probably around the same time that I was where I was in Oklahoma. So we spent like a decent amount of time, 3 hours from each other.
Yeah.
You know, so it's really interesting that we'd kind of find a way to be collaborating now. And it's like,
yeah, in the mountains.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know if it's for me, like picking up on a particular pace, or, there's like something that's like familiar. I still think we've done this a couple of times, and I feel like I'm more or less like trying to kind of find my place within the context of your writing and reading. And so to kind of fill in places, or kind of like be in the, not necessarily the background, but like maybe in kind of like pulled back.
Yeah. Just thinking about like, I don't know, the conversation or whatever, right? It's like the way most people converse, right? There's like people spill and people collect, and like two people sort of listen, but people have sort of different cadences of transmitting like brain thought to like vocalized thought, and people have different cadences of like parsing information that's been said and then like actualizing it and then processing it. And I mean, I feel like there's definitely not enough time in the program, but also like maybe it's a silly gesture to try and figure out like what, when people say like, oh no, there's just good lube, or it just gels or whatever. But I think of like all of the like really important, I don't know, sort of like musical influences of my life, whether it's like AMM or The Dead or like Yellow Swans, in which I feel like of course the individual components are really important. Like there's no conversation without the individual components, but the conversation is like multiplied, and it's like sort of generosity, and it's like actualization through the like the shuffle or whatever. And yeah, I think it's obviously goes deeper than like this amount of content versus a restrained amount of content versus like doing it at a higher frequency versus like doing it at a lower frequency. It's like so there are so many different things, but yeah.
Yeah, also I feel like like when you asked, I was like, oh, I'd never thought about like the detail of it. I just there's just something I really, really enjoy about it. And like that is almost like enough of an answer where it's like, oh, that's why it happens. It's because there's like the hang before, or like there's like the texting before a gig.
Yeah.
And then there's like the, oh, cool, it's time to hang, and then do it. And then there's the hang after, and just that whole like process of getting to the point of like showtime, is like so enjoyable.
Yeah.
And
Totally.
But I, just to like speak about the text part, like I really struggle with my own practice, like words on a written page, but it's something I often really want to do, and I think I'm always really impressed with the power of the use of words. Like in your reading, like maybe something is settling on the decade, and then just the single use of the word snow, and just like hearing you just read it and the way you read it kind of just had so much power. It like stopped me in my tracks. And so I think I'm trying to sometimes find that when putting together like collages of sound or something, where it's like how can just one moment do the work of the whole thing, and so I do really enjoy spending time with text, and then also like doing work with you.
It's like your materials are similar in a lot of ways, because language, I mean, obviously this can be said for any writer, but language is spoiled because of the fact that it's just it's noise, it's utility, it's everywhere you go. And you're Robbie using engine sounds, and it's really difficult to process something that's so spoiled by its ordinariness into something interesting.
Yeah, it takes like extra energy or something, right, to just like imbue it with even more the thing that it's like sort of already exists as a function for, or whatever.
Yeah, and to make it intriguing, to take something out of its utility and the like drudgery of its everydayness and make it intriguing is like a real challenge. And this is kind of changing the subject, but I wonder, like it the book, it really starts out to me feeling like a love poem, and you have the we, and there's often a sharp transition between the we and the I, and I don't know, that we feels like it has a lot of weight. Do you feel like the book is a love poem?
Yeah, I do. I think that I was like trying my best to write into sense of collectivity or whatever, like myself, but also this sort of these like sort of like everyday objects and instances of like objects conflated with meaning, or like sort of deflated with meaning because of language, and forcing them to sort of exist on like a level planar field, and like for them to like sort of declare themselves to me based on their sort of own freakish terms that they sort of present themselves. And yeah, just like thinking about really inhuman like setting, like this road, and the back and forth on this road, but thinking about how all of these sort of like the people and like the and also the, of course, like the more than human world are all animated by these like forces, and like language, one of these forces, like one of the primary forces, and trying to play into maybe even force like a collectivity, or like get a sense of collectivity that can begin to like stand itself against crappy like constant oppressive forces that make us all feel bad all the time, right? And just like hoping to like animate objects in a way that feels like a little empowering for once, making the really like a really nasty, hellish landscape seem like it could be maybe a thing that staves off the big bad thing. Yeah.
The kind of breakdown of syntax that happens is very consonant with the idea of this kind of collectivity, because what allows syntax to move forward and be sensical is the subject, or like the figure and the ground. And when you're kind of collapsing that, and there's no single distinct subject anymore, then the language has to become, fragmented or scattered in this way, which I find very beautiful. And yeah, I definitely felt like there was this invocation of, or at least a desire for, the ability to invoke a collective creaturely experience.
Yeah, creaturely experience.
Yeah.
That's like kind of what, yeah, exactly. Creaturely. My friend Cassandra writes this like afterword at the end of the book that I won't read, but I won't read the whole thing, but really quickly, excerpts really quick. Unfortunately, this note comes to you from an austere, calloused lesbian hand. This is a book about the pastoral imprisoned. Lock her up. The Great Escape held hostage, a breath of fresh air finding its corroded counterpart. Foreclosed opportunities co-pilot all moments of intimacy, and everything good comes caustic with memento mori. Many have said, another tome about... redacted. To which I merely say, have you looked past to admire the greenery in decline? Which, yeah, austere, calloused lesbian hand.
Yeah, I really also like the idea of the pastoral imprisoned.
Yeah, I'm like thinking about just those like giant swaths of land out there that are like, 490 like acres.
Yeah.
For like cow to be fed GMO grain on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's about time to wrap up, and I'd just like to hear from both of you where people can learn more about your work.
Yeah, so I have like the piece I'm working on right now will be up at Spencer Brownstone Gallery in New York. And it's kind of built around Shane Darwent, the sculptor I've been talking about, his sculpture show. And then I play with Evan from Notice Recordings on the 29th at Avalon. And yeah, and then, you can find my stuff on like RobbieWing.com, which doesn't get updated that much, so I don't know if you can find my stuff there. It depends on when I get around to it, or Bandcamp or whatever, or you could just reach out.
Yeah. This book that I'm reading from just entered its second printing earlier last week, and like most small presses, is distributed through asterism.com. Around the Hudson Valley, I think there are a couple places to buy it, but if not, you can always just ask your local bookstore to bring it in. And I have another book coming out at the end of this year through a Brooklyn-based press called Beautiful Days. And I think that it comes out in October. But otherwise, yeah, you can just like get in touch. I don't know. Just easily Googleable name. Yeah, there aren't many Skrabalaks out there, so you can just kind of punch it into the search bar.
Yes, well, I can also link to your websites in the show notes. Well, Robbie Wing and Ryan Skrabalak, thanks for talking with me. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks, Miriam. Thank you.